see on the screen now is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a politician who wants to turn America into a sort of new Sweden.
I am running to fight for improved and expanded Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee.
She is the youngest congresswoman in American history and one of the most well-known faces of the Democratic Party. She openly defines herself as a democratic socialist. She has millions of Twitter followers and, well, millions of critics too, both inside and outside of her own party. Think about it. In a country like the United States, the word socialist brings up images of Soviet dictatorship. Nevertheless, in a moment when the Democrats are having an identity crisis, her narrative seems to be a winning formula for the next election. But what does Ocasio-Cortez really stand for? What is democratic socialism all about? Well, in this video, we're going to tell you. A few months ago, we published a VisualPolitik video about the ideological shift in the Republican Party after Trump's victory in 2016. Something similar is happening in the Democratic Party too. At the end of the day, when a political party loses an election, its members wonder why. And this is when the ideological brainstorming starts. In this case, we're talking about a brand new generation of Democratic politicians, mainly young women, that have broken all kinds of records. For example, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, the first Muslim women in Congress, and in the case of Ilhan Omar, the first congresswoman who wears a headscarf too. But we aren't just talking about gender and age. This new wave of politicians is extremely social media savvy, and they're making breakthroughs inside of the traditional Democratic platform. Then again, the most famous of all of them is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the poster child of democratic socialism. As you can imagine, Ocasio-Cortez soon became the target of every critic from the conservative side. But make no mistake, even the old Democratic Guard is not a big fan of hers. For example, one of her biggest political projects is the so-called Green New Deal. This is a package of social and ecological policies, but not even the Democratic Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, agrees with it. In some interviews, she clearly despises it. And this is surprising given that Ocasio-Cortez and Pelosi belong to the same political party. And I know what you're thinking. Democratic socialism is nothing new in America, right? At the end of the day, it's what Bernie Sanders stood for back in 2016. And yeah, you're right. The difference is that now, though, we aren't just talking about one candidate, but a whole movement that seems to be getting bigger and bigger. Sanders, as leftist as he was on economic issues, tended to be much more conservative on social ones. For example, he was not big on anti-gun laws, immigration, or even racial issues. Nevertheless, both Ocasio-Cortez and her colleagues mark a turning point in Democratic history. And maybe they even represent a turning point in American political history too. So now the question becomes, is it possible that one of the most capitalist countries in the world can turn into a socialist one? And what kind of socialism does Ocasio-Cortez propose? Is it really that similar to the Nordic model that she claims to defend? Well, today we're going to answer all of these questions, but before we do, let's take a look back at the history.
New faces, old ideas.
And I know what many of you might be thinking. You're probably thinking, come on Simon, there can't be socialists in the Democratic Party. This is America, and all American politicians pretty much agree on the basics, right? But here's the thing, the Democratic Party is one of the oldest parties in political history. They've been around for almost 200 years, and this is more than enough time for them to develop some ideological twists. For example, during most of the 19th century, pro-slavery politicians were Democrats. Even several decades after Abraham Lincoln, who, by the way, was the first Republican president, abolished slavery, many Democratic politicians kept saying things like this.
We reorganized the Democratic Party with one plank and only one plank, namely, that this is a white man's country, and the white man must govern it. Benjamin Tillman, Senator, South Carolina, Democrat, 1895 to 1918.
Of course, all of this has changed radically. Nowadays, the Democratic Party is seen as the party of racial diversity. But this example, it helps to illustrate how parties can evolve ideologically. Something similar happens with economics. During the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt introduced radical changes to the American system. Tax raises, the welfare state, and lots of regulations for companies all came into effect. But the Clinton and even the Obama administration were much more moderate.
I'm a strong believer in the free market. I'm a strong believer in capitalism. But I'm also a strong believer that there are certain common goods that require to have some regulation. Barack Obama.
In other words, the Democratic Party holds a huge range of ideologies that stretch from the center to the left. For example, Abigail Spanberg is one of the politicians who belongs to the so-called Blue Dog Coalition. This is the moderate group. But we also have the more radical members, and among those is our protagonist today, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. During an interview with PBS, she was asked about the end of capitalism, and well, this was her answer.
I think that we're going to see an evolution in our economic system of an unprecedented degree, and it's hard to say what direction that takes. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
But, as we said before, she is not the only one. For example, Ilhan Omar is the first Somali woman to be elected to Congress, and she identifies as a democratic socialist too. Nevertheless, her proposals are so extreme that not even the socialists want to put her in their group. Why? Basically because of her position against the Israeli settlements and the military occupation of Palestine. In America, this kind of position is extremely controversial. So yes, we can say that this new wave of Democratic politicians is groundbreaking. Indeed, while we were making this video, House Democrats started investigating Deutsche Bank for some loans that they made to Donald Trump, and they even claimed that the bank was one of the world's biggest money launderers. And all of this is at a time when primary elections are getting closer and closer. Many of these congresswomen might actually run as candidates. This means that the next American president might be a self-proclaimed socialist. But what does democratic socialism really mean? Well, let's have a look, shall we?
European imports.
If you're watching this video from Europe, I'm pretty sure you're going to be familiar with the words social democracy. In fact, one of Europe's biggest political parties is the Social Democrat Party. But where does social democracy come from? Well, to find out about that, we need to travel back in time to the beginning of the 20th century. In the year 1970, the Bolshevik Revolution started in Russia. All of a sudden, the biggest country in Europe made a radical shift in their political system and decided to go for a Marxist-Leninist approach. So what are the principles of Marxism? In this video we published years ago, we tell you what Marxism is all about. The thing is, from the very beginning, those Bolsheviks had an international aim. That's why in 1919 they created the Comintern, an organization to manage all the communist parties worldwide. Their goal was to help, both with training and funding, of all the political parties that wanted to follow in Russia's footsteps. In other words, all of the parties that wanted a communist revolution. But as it always happens in life, the devil is in the details. And there is a very important detail that we need to cover when we talk about the communist revolution.
Communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Communist Manifesto, Chapter 4.
Yep, you heard that right. Communists wanted to end capitalism through violence. And this is where the big break inside of Marxism-inspired movement started. On one hand, we have the pure communists who wanted a revolution. On the other hand, we have the so-called social democrats with famous intellectuals and politicians like Rose from Luxembourg. Basically, social democrats wanted to end capitalism using the toolset of a liberal democracy. This means they wanted to run for election, little by little, change the laws until they achieved a socialist system. To the Russian communists, social democrats were betraying the working class. If you sleep with the enemy, you will end up joining him.
But the truth is, social democrats worked pretty well all over Europe, at least election-wise, and the region where they were most successful was in the Scandinavian countries. Sweden, Norway, and Denmark had social democratic governments for decades. This is why these countries have very generous welfare states with universal healthcare, lots of public services, and, of course, high taxes.
And this is why many of these democratic socialist politicians say they're inspired by the Nordic Model. Chief among them is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Of course, it makes sense. At the end of the day, Denmark and Sweden are very rich countries with wonderful standards of living. I mean, who would want to live in Copenhagen with a salary of $3,000 a month, free higher education, and free hospitals? But the question we should ask now is, can we really say that the Nordic countries are socialist? Well, let's find out.
The Nordic Model.
Communists got one thing right. If you play by the rules of the bourgeoisie, you'll end up becoming one of them. And this is exactly what happened to all of those social democratic parties. Little by little, they ended up abandoning Marxism and anti-capitalism. You see, the basic foundation of Marxism is the social ownership of the means of production. Despite what a lot of people might say, Marx wouldn't have any problem with you owning an iPhone or a house. These are consumption goods which you use for yourself. The problem comes when you want to own things to produce other things that you can sell in the market. These are the so-called means of production or means of capital. Communists are against the private ownership of those means. But as I said before, we've got a video where we explain what Marxism is all about. You can find it linked to in the description below. And by the way, remember, if you're interested in these kinds of topics, do remember that we publish brand new videos every week, so be sure to subscribe to VisualPolitik and hit that bell button so you won't miss any posts. But going back to today's story, how do you socialize the means of production? Well, you can achieve this in a lot of different ways, from nationalizing companies to having cooperatives where the workers are also shareholders. Well, now you might be wondering, well, are there many state-owned companies in Sweden? Are there many cooperatives? And the answer is not really. In fact, it's kind of the opposite.
Sweden tops global privatization ranking. No country has privatized and deregulated public services as fast as Sweden, according to a new report from the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation.
You see, every year the Heritage Foundation publishes a World Economic Freedom ranking. According to this, America is the 12th freest economy on the planet. Denmark ranks in at 14th and Sweden comes in at 19th. In the last 2 decades, these countries have made a lot of radical free market reforms. In many respects, you might even argue that Sweden is even more capitalist than America. Want an example? Well, take a look at the educational system. The United States was one of the first countries to provide universal access to education. This education is provided through public schools, which are funded and managed by the federal government or the states. Sweden is a different animal. They have more and more private schools in competition with the state-owned ones. Of course, the government guarantees universal access, but instead of micromanaging education, what they do is give the money to the citizens so that they can choose which school they want their children to attend. This is called the school voucher system, and it seems like the country is turning to a similar model when it comes to healthcare. Denmark is following suit, and of course, when it comes to the minimum wage, these countries don't have one. Of course, Denmark has a great unemployment insurance program, but there is no minimum wage. So while Ocasio-Cortez wants to have a $15 an hour minimum wage, it might or it might not be a good idea, but it's definitely got nothing to do with the Nordic Model, where the labor market is pretty deregulated. And this is why the Danish Prime Minister said this during an official visit to America.
I know that some people in the US associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Of course, Denmark has higher income taxes than America. For example, the top marginal tax rate is 56%. But this also means less central government debt has been required to support government spending. For example, America's central government debt surpassed 105% of GDP. This means that the US government owes more than the total size of the American economy each year.
In Denmark, this number is as low as 35%, and the same goes for the public deficit. While the White House spends more than what they collect in taxes, Denmark is much more responsible. And in the long run, this means much fewer problems and much more stability. This explains why the Scandinavian economies are so business-friendly and so attractive to foreign investors. In fact, big firms like H&M, the fashion retailer, Spotify, the music streaming platform, and many others were born in Sweden, which is a country with a population as small as the state of Georgia's. Of course, many of Ocasio-Cortez's or even Bernie Sanders' stances on issues really do match the Nordic model. For example, everything regarding Medicare. But many others have nothing to do with the Scandinavian countries. So now the question passes to you. Do you think this brand new wave of Democratic politicians can capture the soul of their party? Will we see a new ideological shift in the Democrats, just like what we witnessed in the Republican Party? Well, please leave your answer in the comment section below. Also, please don't forget to visit our friends at Reconsider Media, the podcast that provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, remember that we publish brand new videos every week, so do subscribe and hit that bell button so you won't miss out on any posts. And if you like this video, do give it a thumbs up. And as always, I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more more about politics and hear more of my lovely voice, don't forget to check out the Reconsider podcast at reconsidermedia.com. Reconsider is a podcast that challenges you to reconsider your views by providing context, but we don't do the thinking for you.